Rent Fena is a 25-year-old unskilled adventurer who has been stuck in bronze class for 10 years, but manages to scrape a living through hunting slimes and goblins for a few coins each day. While exploring the moon's reflection labyrinth, he stumbles across a completely undiscovered tunnel, which he explores alone. As he cautiously makes his way into the room, he realizes his mistake. A legendary monster, the kind of creature he's only heard of in tales, is waiting for him. Rent is powerless to stop it. At that moment, Rent accepts his fate, and he is devoured by the monster. Sometime later, Rent finds himself mysteriously resurrected as an undead skeleton. As undead are cursed, Rent cannot return home in case a priest destroys him. He realizes the dragon is gone and decides to get out of the place. As he walks, he sees another skeleton appear and confront Rent. Rent wants to defeat it with his sword, but he recognizes that it's hard to move his body without any muscles. He raises his sword to strike this skeleton, but he ends up falling behind. The other skeleton also trips after losing its leg bone. He then suddenly finds out that he can still use spirit energy to buff up his physical attributes despite not being human. With this buff, he manages to destroy the skull. After killing it, he absorbs its spirit energy and remembers that monsters can evolve with enough spirit energy. He thus makes it his goal to evolve into a ghoul, since ghouls do possess flesh, making it possible to disguise himself and return home to get help. After killing skeletons and slimes in one day, he gets used to his new body, regains his former magic skills, and slowly realizes he is becoming stronger and more skilled with his sword than when he was human. After defeating another slime, he absorbs its spirit energy, and his skeleton body is wrapped in dead flesh. He finally evolves into a ghoul, giving him hope he can return home. But first he must relearn how to speak using his desiccated, half-rotted ghoul vocal cords. After regaining flesh, Rent can fight stronger monsters and use more powerful spells, confirming he is much stronger than his human body. He hears the sound of swords clashing nearby. Curious, he investigates and finds a new adventurer, Rena Lupage, fighting for her life against a skeleton. Rent jumps in to help, using his experience to take down the skeleton and save Rena's life. Rena is shocked and confused to see a skeleton fighting alongside her. Rent tries to communicate with her, but his skeletal voice is barely audible. Rent is still able to explain what happened to him. Rent desperately needs a way to cover up his undead body so that he can leave the dungeon and find a way to become human again. Rent gives Rena all of his money and asks her to buy him some clothes to cover up his body. He tells her that he is also an adventurer, but he doesn't explain why he is a monster. Rena agrees to help, and she goes to the town to get a map from the guild and buy some clothes for Rent. When Rena returns, she gives Rent the clothes she bought, which are of good quality. She also shows him a mirror so that he can see how his face looks. Rent is shocked to see his skeletal face and realizes that he needs the clothes to cover it up. As a final item, Rena gives Rent a mysterious mask that looks special. The mask turns out to be a cursed item she unknowingly bought from a shady merchant that attaches to Rent's face and cannot be removed. He decides to put up with it since he has to hide his face anyway, and he will ask a priest to remove it later. For her mistake, Rena assists him in returning home to Malt Village, but they are stopped by a suspicious soldier at the entrance. The soldier becomes even more suspicious when he hears Rent's strange voice and demands to see his face, but Rena tells them the mask is cursed and he can't take it off. She says he was fatally injured while fighting a monster. Rent shows them part of his ears, and they're surprised by how scarred it is. Rent tells them to try to pull the mask off themselves, and one of the guards tries to remove it himself but fails. Finally, the soldier lets them enter the city. Once in the city, Rent sneaks away, not wanting to put Rena at further risk of discovery, but he will see her again someday. He decides to visit his friend Lorraine Vivi, a silver-class adventurer, who recognizes him immediately. Rent tells Lorraine what happened to him, but Lorraine does not believe him. She has been researching monsters and magic, and she has never come across a circumstance in which someone has been turned into an undead after being eaten by dragons. Lorraine asks him what he plans to do with his life, and he tells her he wants to continue living as an adventurer. He aims to achieve the highest rank in the guild, but he knows he can't go to the guild looking like an undead. Lorraine has no choice but to believe his story and decide he can live with her. However, Rent needs to return the favor and help her with her research with his undead buddy. The next day, Lorraine comes back to the house, and she gives him the payment for the slime liquids and magic crystals he got from the labyrinth. He takes the payment and tells her he will be going to see an infamous blacksmith. He arrives at the blacksmith's shop, and Rent apologizes for his suspicious look. She asks him what he wants, and he drops his sword on the counter and tells her he needs a new one. She notices the sword was treated well, but it has been overused. She asks him if he uses magic or spirit energy, and he tells her he uses mana, spirit, and divinity magic. She is surprised because they are very rare. Rent asks her to keep his secret and presents her with a bag of coins. She tells him her husband may call him several times to get his opinions on how he wants his sword to look. Meanwhile, Lorraine recalls in her youth how nothing interested her. Even becoming a doctor and silver-class adventurer did not fill her with pride until a friend asked her to tutor Rent, who was an iron-ranked novice. One day, while collecting herbs in the forest, Rent is distracted by something in the forest. She glances in the direction he's looking at to see a goblin notching an arrow into its bow. Rent raises his shield to defend her, and he tells her to use a spell against the goblin. She uses the spell to completely obliterate the goblin. Rent praises her magic level, but she tells him it's nothing special. After the battle, Lorraine realized Rent was superior to her in actual adventuring. She decided to learn from him instead, which ultimately caused her to fall in love. Rent meets with the blacksmith named Clope, and he thanks him for making him a new sword. Clope promises to make him something special, and his wife presents Rent with a temporary sword to use before his own is ready. He takes the sword and leaves. Clope secretly recognizes Rent, but decides to honor Rent's desire for privacy until he is ready to ask for help. Rent returns to the dungeon, hoping to evolve again into something more human-looking. There, he encounters a man fighting a slime monster in the labyrinth, but he's no match for it. Rent saves the man, and the man thanks him, but Rent begins to walk away since adventurers are expected to take care of themselves. The man runs in front of Rent and asks to join his party. The man tells Rent he's a chef, and he has a restaurant. He's in huge debt that he needs to repay by next week. He told every adventurer he met he'd do anything they asked as long as they let him join their party, but no one gave him a chance. Deciding to help, Rent takes him to the empty dragon's lair, hoping to find undiscovered treasure, but the chef blunders into a teleportation circle. When Rent follows him, they find themselves in a secret boss room facing the undead skeleton of a giant. He tries a spirit attack on it, but it's ineffective. The skeleton tries to strike back, but Rent dodges away. He decides to use his divinity skill, even though he doesn't know if his sword can handle it. He attacks the skeleton with a skill, and he takes out its leg. The skeleton loses its balance and falls to the ground, and Rent uses that opportunity to land a final blow on the skeleton's skull. After healing the man, Rent gives him his magic stone from the giant skeleton. In gratitude, the chef agrees to visit shops for Rent and give him meals at his restaurant whenever he wants. Rent notices another teleportation circle that leads deeper into the unexplored area. Back in the city, the chef, Loris, and his wife, Isabel, are grateful, so Rent trusts them to keep his name secret. He arrives at Lorraine's house, where Rent finds his mind affected by dark impulses, and his mask's mouthpiece magically vanishes, allowing him to bite an unsuspecting Lorraine. She pushes him off, wondering if the real Rent is still somewhere inside his body. She uses her magic to knock him down and put him to sleep. Rent wakes up later in the night with a severe headache. Lorraine asks if he feels controlled by any monster or an unnatural impulse. He informs her that he is not being controlled, and Lorraine feels relieved. Rent heals her wound, but admits he has cannibalistic urges. Lorraine notices that he looks changed. He takes off his clothes to examine himself, and she tells him he can tell people that the scars on his body are from previous battles. The mask, while still stuck to his face, now responds to his thoughts and can reveal his mouth or eyes at will. Lorraine realizes he has achieved existential evolution, and by drinking her blood, he actually evolved into a ghast. They're weaker than even a lesser vampire. Rent realizes that if he keeps evolving, he could become a human-looking vampire. Lorraine agrees to help in exchange for letting her examine his body for academic research. As his sword is still not finished, Rent borrows a temporary one from Clope so he can visit the unexplored area. Rent notices Loris and Isabel have reopened their restaurant. Lorraine demonstrates to Rent how alchemy can turn items that are normally harmless to people into poisons that kill not only them but even larger creatures. Lorraine creates a poison that Rent tries out. He begins to make guttural sounds, and Lorraine asks if she should cast the antidote spell. Lorraine discovers Rent is immune to poison, no longer requires sleep, and can keep his cannibalistic urges away with drops of blood. The next day, Rent enters the guild, looking quite mysterious. He looks around and feels nostalgic about the last time he came to the guild. He notices the guild secretary Sheila and is relieved to see she's doing well. He approaches her and says he wants to sign up as a new adventurer. Rent learns from Lorraine that he was actually popular at the guild, so if he tries to take a quest using his own name, people will definitely ask questions. Instead, Rent re-registers as a novice but changes his surname to Vivi to pose as Lorraine's distant relative. He submits the form to Sheila, who looks at his name, and she's surprised he's named Rent. He asks her why she's surprised, and she tells him an adventurer named recently went missing. She tells him to wait for her while she completes the registration process. Rent is relieved that he told her he was related to Lorraine. He did not want the rumors to damage her reputation. Sheila comes back and hands him his ID card, telling him he's now an Iron Rank adventurer. Afterwards, Rent explores more of the unexplored area, and he walks to the teleportation circle. He is transported to a room with a skeleton lying on the bed, but it doesn't look like an undead. Suddenly, a lady asks him what he's doing. Rent tells her he was searching the room for something valuable since he's an adventurer. She attacks Rent, and he tries to use his divinity to block it. But the attack was too powerful, and it was pushed back into the wall. But after seeing his ghastly body, she replaces his destroyed clothing with her own cloak. She also gives him an acacia map that will record everywhere he travels in exchange for keeping her location secret. She tells him their trade is complete, and she will be sending him back to the entrance. Lorraine is impressed. The map is as valuable as a national treasure, and the cloak is magic-resistant and stronger than armor. Rent tries to visit the woman again, but finds she has sealed off the area. Meanwhile, most of the guild started to really miss Rent, as most of them actually learned adventuring from him as novices. Rent is given the opportunity to graduate from Iron class to Bronze class. He earns a perfect score on the written exam. For the practical exam, he is partnered up with swordsman Rise Dunner and sorceress Laura Sadii to compete with other parties to be the first to reach a specified room in the New Moon Labyrinth by sunset. They arrive at the labyrinth, and the other adventurers rush inside. But Rent spots the first obstacle. The maps are old and unreliable, so they buy a new one. They enter the labyrinth and are shortly stopped by some skeletons. Rent warns them not let down their guard against the skeleton. Laura utilizes her magic to boost their abilities, and she charges at the skeleton. They effortlessly defeat them, and Rent is surprised by their abilities given at a young age. Rent believes something must have attracted them in, so he approaches a purse on the ground. Rent hands him the pouch of incense that attracts the skeleton. He warns them of an upcoming ambush. Rent decides to go first, and he warns them to be ready to back him up. An adventurer goes to attack him, but he deflects it. Rise and Laura rush up to him, and Rent leaves the first adventurer to rise because he will deal with the archer. The archer tries to notch another arrow, but Rent strikes him down first. Rent also swiftly defeats the mage. Laura casts a bright light to distract the swordsman, giving Raze an opportunity to unleash his attack. They defeat the swordsman through teamwork and capture the adventurers. After they leave, a nearby examiner is impressed. Rent noticed their attackers were also examiners tasked with making the exam more difficult. Meanwhile, Guildmaster Wolf asks Sheila to keep an eye on Rent, as his sudden appearance and advanced skills are suspicious. Rent's party reaches their goal, a boss room. Another party also arrives, but due to their arrogance, Rent lets them go first. Watching them be swiftly defeated confirms more examiners are nearby to ensure no one actually dies, making Rise and Laura more confident as they enter the boss room for their turn. The boss turns out to be a grand slime. Rent chose not to fight so Rise and Laura could gain combat experience. Rise dashes towards the grand slime, which is preparing to attack him. He predicts it and dodges it perfectly. Rent advises him to aim for the slime's core. But after Rise sinks his blade into the slime, he is unable to move it any farther. The slime knocks him to the ground, but he gets back up and avoids the slime's further strikes. Laura is going to assist him with her magic, but Rent instructs her to focus on gathering her mana. Rent is convinced that, with their combined powers, they will be able to defeat the grand slime. Laura eventually gathers enough mana to cast her magic, which she informs them about. She performs a fire spell on the slime, which melts. Rent instructs Raze to finish off the slime before it regenerates. Raze slashes through the slime's core, and they're relieved they were able to defeat the monster. As the first party to arrive, they are promoted to bronze and also receive potions and a carrying case. On the way back, Rent shows Rise and Laura how challenging labyrinths can be, as one floor is a giant forest whose geography changes constantly. Back in the city, they present the crests to Sheila, who acknowledges the completion of their bronze rank Ascension exam. A guild official hands her a report and says he can confirm them as bronze rank adventurers. Rise asks about what is going on, and Rent informs him that the official was observing them throughout the exam, but the others were unaware of it. Rise and Laura are overjoyed that they passed. They leave the guild, and Rise and Laura are grateful to Rent that they finally became real adventurers. Rise and Laura depart, but hope to see Rent again. Sheila finally asks Rent if he is actually the Rent Fena who went missing. Rent is unsure about telling her, so she signs a magic contract that will make her his slave for life if she reveals the secret. Rent decides to sign the contract and explain everything to Sheila. Once Rent tells her everything, she decides to help him. They both go to Lorraine's house, and she is surprised to see Sheila with Rent. Sheila informs her that she has something to discuss with her. Lorraine asks Rent if he touched Sheila, but Sheila says he simply shared information with her. Lorraine is suspicious and considers murdering Sheila to protect Rent, but is eventually convinced of her good intentions. Sheila reveals that novice adventurers had been mysteriously disappearing throughout the kingdom, and the guild is treating it as a mass kidnapping. Wolf suspects Rent is the kidnapper, so Rent decides to avoid the guild for several days, while Sheila convinces Wolf he is trustworthy. While receiving his sword from Clope, Rent learns of a powerful new technique that might be the key to reaching Mithril class. But to use it, he will need high-quality equipment. The only problem is how to make money while avoiding the guild. Fortunately, Rent encounters Ryuntas from Tatsu village, who offers work not approved by the guild. Ryunta's sister is going to become a sacrifice to the Lake Lord in Tatsu village, where young girls are forced to be sacrificed so the Lake Lord will not destroy the village. Runtus asks Rent to help him because his younger sister is the next victim. Rent realizes that Runtus's request is to save his sister rather than defeat the master of the Laker. He believes he will not have to fight, but he still senses something is wrong. They arrive in the village, and Rent realizes that it is silent. Rent meets Ryunta's sister, Amaris, but she scolds Ryuntas for bringing Rent, as she has agreed to be sacrificed. Later, Ryuntas apologizes for his sister's stubbornness. Rent knows the festival is the next day, and he informs Ryuntas that Amaris will not run away if they instruct her to. Ryuntas begs him to do everything possible to save his sister. The next day, Rent is on his way back from the lake when he encounters some traveling merchants. Because business has been slow, one of the merchants offers goodies to some of the children in exchange for their parents purchasing from them. The merchant realizes that he has not seen Rent in the village before. He asks if he's there for the festival, to which Rent responds that it is why he's in the village. The merchant warns Rent that he can't come at a terrible moment since the lake's master is upset. Runtus notifies him that lunch is ready. Rent asks if the merchants come to the village regularly, and Runtus confirms that they do. During the sacrifice, Rent, Ryuntas, and Amaris all watch as the Lake Lord appears. Rent knocks the orb out of her hand and instructs them to stay close to the boat. Rent steps out of the boat onto the lake, and everyone is amazed he can walk on it. Rent is aware that krakens can only be found in the sea and do not shoot fireballs. He rushes for it, But he passes through the kraken and lands on the other side, where a massive boat is docked. Rent deduces it is actually an illusion spell cast by the traders. The other merchants begin to attack him, but he deflects their strikes and deals with them. After defeating them, they admitted that they used the ploy to kidnap the girls and sell them as slaves. With all the girls rescued, Rent receives payment and a surprise kiss from Amorous. As the traders only targeted young girls, Rent concludes they are not involved with the missing adventurers. Rent walks into the guild and looks through the requests on the board. Sheila asks Rent to find a dragon blood rose, even though the quest only pays 1 bronze coin. Dragon bloods are linked to a legendary love between a dragon and a human. Rent agrees, as they also make powerful medicine, and the quest was posted by the Malt Orphanage. They said they needed to plant to save someone important to them. Rent arrives at the orphanage, and he didn't expect the place to be as run down as it is. A little girl answers the door, mistaking him for a debt collector. Rent explains that he is an adventurer who took up their request from the guild. The girl apologizes for her misunderstanding before welcoming him into the orphanage. The girl introduces him as an adventurer, and everyone rushes to greet him. They ask him several things, but the girl advises them to approach adventurers with caution because they are dangerous. They apologize to her for their behavior. She assures Rent that she wasn't referring to him as a dangerous adventurer, but he understands her caution around adventurers. He tells her she is correct to be careful of them. Rent introduces himself as a bronze rank adventurer, which surprises the girl because she assumed only an iron rank adventurer would accept their request. She introduces herself to him as Elias. She brings him into Lillian's room, where she is the orphanage's administrator, and presents herself as the priestess of the Church of the Eastern Sky. Lillian apologizes for the little payout for the request. She thanks him for taking on the task of cleaning the cellar, as she cannot get the kids to do it because monsters spawn there. She has a cough, and Elias urges her to relax while she fills Rent in on the remaining details. They leave the room, and Rent learns from Elias that Lillian has malacumula, a disease that makes her sick when she uses magic and will kill her one day. Rent deals with rat monsters in their basement, but when the boss rat bites him, his blood tames it into his familiar, a power usually found in vampires. Rent returns with the rat, and Lorraine is amazed to see it sitting on his shoulder. Rent explained what happened, and he decides to name the rat Black, but Lorraine decides to name it Edel, and the rat agrees with her. Lorraine discovers that Rent can eat normal food if it contains her blood. Rent travels to Tarask Swamp, where being undead luckily protects him from the poisonous air. Suddenly, several goblins shoot arrows at Rent, but he deflects them. Then he charges at them, taking out a group with a single swing of his sword. While discussing Rent's work in Tatsu village, which he refused to publicly take credit for, Sheila and Lorraine realize they do not know why Rent is fixated on reaching mithril class. Rent is pursued by the Tarask dragon, and he regrets purchasing cheap holy water. He comes to a dead end and chooses to confront the dragon front on. He jumps from a tree branch to fight the dragon, but it shoots poison. Rent cuts through the poison and hits the dragon with his mana-infused blade. Unfortunately, it doesn't work on dragon. Edel rushes at the dragon, using divinity. The monster eats Edel, but the dragon chokes and spits him out. Rent catches Edel and is grateful that Edel gave him an idea for defeating the monster. He infuses his blade with divinity and charges at the beast. He attacks the dragon with his sword and effortlessly defeats it. He understands that the monster's weakness is divinity. Then he decides to keep the dragon in his magic pouch. He arrives at a large cluster of dragon blood flowers, and he notices its power purifying the air around them. He intends to take more than he came for, but a man comes from behind. The man is amazed to encounter another person in the swamp. The elf, Isaac Hart, requires dragon blood medicine for his ill employer, and he has always been looking for someone who regularly delivers more dragon bloods to him. Isaac asks if Rent is an adventurer, and he presents himself as a bronze rank adventurer. Isaac is confident that Rent will be suited for the job because of his rank. He informs Rent that if he accepts the terms of his request, he will be very thankful. Back in the city, Tarask dragons are famously difficult to defeat, so Rent secretly takes them to the guild's monster butcher, Dario. Rent is concerned about the price, but Dario tells him that it will be high. Rent later delivers a dragon blood flower to Elise and also gives extra ones to healer Umberto and herbalist Norman. Rent wonders if they'll want some more, and they tell him they'll be grateful to get some more. Rent gives them a magic bag holding more of the plant. He tells them not to bother paying him and to use the medicine to help others. At Edel's urging, the remaining rat monsters agree to protect the orphanage. Elise decides to become an adventurer like Rent, and get the plant herself if no adventurer takes up the request. Rent advises her to learn magic as well, as she has mana. Elise informs him that she doesn't have enough money to pay for the classes that will teach her magic and sword skills. Rent informs her that he has an acquaintance who can teach her for free. Rent returns to Lorraine's house. He asks Lorraine to teach Elise magic. She tells him she can teach magic, but she's upset since he claims she always has free time, making her seem jobless. Rent informs her that he rarely meets with young women, so he cannot understand their emotions. Lorraine tries to explain that she is a young girl, but Rent does not view her as such. Lorraine decides to blow him up, but when Rent desperately showers her with compliments, she becomes embarrassed. The next day, Rent learns from Sheila that Isaac works for the mysterious and powerful Luder family. As refusing a request from them would be dangerous, Rent visits their mansion, but learns from their security guard that access is only granted by successfully making it through a constantly changing maze. His only clue to making it through is that the sun cannot help him. Rent is confident, as the maze appears quite small. However, after several hours, he becomes hopelessly lost. Rent eventually makes his way to the center of the maze, speaks to a young woman, and discovers she is a collector of magical items found in labyrinths. After receiving the same hint about not relying on the sun, he continues onward. Suddenly, the sun disappears, and Rent looks around to see what happened. He throws a small stone up and disappears. He realizes the maze is actually teleporting him around. Once he finally exits the maze, he finds the mansion and the girl, who introduces herself as Laura, head of the Luder family. Rent is then offered his reward. She invites him inside and tells him he can choose any magical tool from their collection. At first, he is drawn to a mana-controlled airship model, but the high mana consumption makes it impractical for scouting and more like a toy. Rent touches a magic tool by accident that absorbs his mana and begins to glow. The surroundings begin to tremble, and several body parts join up with a hand to form a huge body armor. Rent can't believe his eyes, and he unsheathes his sword, ready to face the armor golem. The golem attacks Rent, but he dodges out of the way on time. Isaac searches for the deactivation device, and Laura urges him to hurry up. The golem fires a beam, leaving Rent wondering how long it will be active because it only took a small percentage of his mana. Laura tells him the golem only needs the mana to activate, but it absorbs mana from its surroundings to get stronger. He was forced to use his magic spirit fusion technique, even though he would rather not reveal his secret technique to anyone. The golem rushes at him, but Laura stops it with a single word, and Rent believes the golem was deactivated just in time. Isaac apologizes for putting him in danger, but Rent explains that it was because of his carelessness. Laura asks Rent if he wants to keep looking at the magic tool, and he says yes. They continue going, and something catches Rent's attention. Rent is drawn to a vial of vampire blood, which, in theory, could turn him into a human-looking vampire right away. Due to the uncertainty, Rent takes the airship as his reward and forms a contract to keep supplying Laura with dragon bloods. Rent is surprised to also be rewarded with vampire blood for free. Rent returns home, and Lorraine wishes he would not take the risk and remain as he is now. But she is also aware of Rent's burning desire to evolve and become a mithril-class adventurer. Wanting to understand his motivation, Lorraine finally asks Rent why he wants to reach mithril class so much. Rent explains that, as a child, he was very shy, while his friend Jinlin was the one who wanted to be an adventurer. One day, they were attacked by a wolf monster that killed his parents and her grandmother. The wolf monster appeared from the forest in front of Rent, but he was too afraid to react. Jinlin instantly grabbed him, and they left the scene. The beast went on in a different direction, and while Rent knew it was terrible to leave everyone else behind, he was certain that only the two of them remained alive. They ran until they were exhausted, and Jinlin was confident that they were safe. They immediately heard footsteps, and the monster appeared on a cliff above them. The massive wolf jumped off the ledge, and Rent could tell it was mercilessly toying with them. The wolf rushed at Rent, but Jinlin pushed him away in time to save him. Jinlin reminded him that she promised to protect him and encouraged him to grow stronger. The monster was about to take Rent down too, but Rent was saved by a mithril-class adventurer named Wilfried Ryoker. Wilfried rushed toward the monster, sparking furious combat between the two. Wilfried then leaps into the air and delivers a strong strike on the ground, but the monster ducks to avoid it. Wilfried was surprised that the monster was still looking for a fight, despite being injured. The beast then abruptly turned around and ran away. Wilfried approached Rent, asking whether he was all right, but Rent questioned why the adventurer hadn't come sooner. Wilfried accepted his own fault and apologized to Rent, but Rent was too filled with sadness to accept his apology. After the incident, Rent started training under a tree, and Wilfried paid him a visit. Rent took the chance to ask Wilfried how he could become adventurer, which shocked Wilfried. Wilfried questioned why he needed to know, and Rent explained to Wilfried that he wanted to carry on the dream of his friend. When Wilfried questioned him about his age, Rent told him he was 5 years old. Wilfried advised Rent to practice in the village before registering at the Adventurers Guild, as he could only do so after reaching the age of 15. He instructed Rent to learn how to fight monsters and study. He also advised him to study herbs and plants while gaining survival techniques. Wilfried instructed him to look for him after he had become an adventurer. Wilfried wasn't sure where he'd be in 10 years, but he was certain he'd still be an adventurer if he survived. He advised Rent not to give up till he achieved his goals. Since then, Rent has dreamed of reaching mithril class so he can show Wilfried he made it. Lorraine allows him to drink the blood, which starts painfully mutating him. Days later, Clope works on an even stronger sword for Rent. Elise is pleased when Lillian starts to recover, and Rise and Laura form a party with Rena. Rent finally awakens with a human appearance, while Lorraine confirms he has successfully evolved into some sort of vampire. Unfortunately, the mask is still stuck in place, but Lorraine is happy to see his face again. Rent wants to see Wilfried, but hears rumors that he left the country, plus he has not reached mithril class yet. Lorraine decides that if Rent does leave, she will go with him. Thank you for watching till the end, and please don't forget to subscribe. See you next time, and peace out.